Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and joining me from Labour Party conference is Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing?
Michael, I'm very well. I hope I can keep my voice for the rest of this hour.
You've been cheering too much when Keir came on the stage, or is it something else?
Oh, I was whooping, I was screaming, I was singing Things Can Only Get Better last night at the CW party, the annual CW bash. No, I wasn't really that well before this conference. I did a literary festival on Saturday with a Novara colleague, then came straight to this. So I'm not in the best of health, but I'm very happy to be here because I think some really interesting stuff is happening.
Well, I hope you're feeling alert, even if your voice is struggling. We will be discussing more from Lebanon. Hundreds have been killed by Israeli strikes. Of course, lots of speculation about possible escalations into a wider war, although lots of people saying it already is a war. As well as that, Labour Party donations continue to be under the spotlight. First, though, Keir Starmer's first speech to Labour Party conference as Prime Minister. Keir Starmer's first conference speech as Prime Minister should have been a bit of a victory party. But this morning he was getting a different message. So this is John Curtis in The Telegraph. So John Curtis, probably our leading sort of electoral expert. The writing is already on the wall for Labour's floundering government. The writing is already on the wall after less than 3 months. He says Keir Starmer's loveless landslide was always volatile, and his weak political antennae has seen his party sink in the polls. That's just one headline, one analyst, but it seems fairly universal that this is the assessment of how Labour are doing. Not many people had predicted this when they first were elected. So could Starmer rise to the occasion and deliver a more positive vision for the country he now runs? Well, he gave it a go, at least.
This is a long-term project. I've never pretended otherwise. But conference, make no mistake, the work of change has begun. The patient, calm, determined era of politics as service has begun. Planning reformed, doctors back in theatre, new solar projects, new offshore wind projects, the onshore ban lifted, Great British Energy launched, one-word Ofsted judgments ended, a border security command, a national wealth fund, getting Britain building again, the Renters Reform Bill, stopping no-fault evictions, and the Railway Services Bill, bringing railways back into public ownership. And we're only just getting started. A crackdown on knife crime, a real living wage, a modern industrial strategy, a 10-year plan for our NHS, devolution to our nation's regions and cities, the biggest levelling up of workers' rights in a generation, more teachers, more neighbourhood police, more operations, rebuilding our public services. Change has begun.
Change begins being sort of the slogan of their whole conference. Now, many people are looking at this saying, we wanted change. We haven't seen it yet. That list, I'm not sure if it's going to reassure many people yet. Of course, after being accused of talking down Britain, Starmer sort of had to do something different. And he tried to talk the country up.
Trust me, nobody anywhere doubts that this is a great nation, a nation known for our creativity, our artistic skill, our scientific genius, and of course, our pragmatism. Quality that, combined with the industry and pride of working people, have not just rewritten our own story, but also that of the world. We could do that again.
I think it's probably a little bit unrealistic to think that Britain is again going to have the impact we had, I suppose, during the Industrial Revolution, which he is referring to there. But if you're going to go for some sort of progressive patriotism, that is actually where I think is sort of the most reasonable place to look. That is the biggest impact that Britain has had in sort of a positive way. If you look at life expectancy, child mortality, all of that. Leading into the patriotic angle, Keir Starmer also used the speech to pledge homes for all veterans who need them. Now, of course, I'm in favour of all homes for veterans. I'm also in favour of homes for everyone, even if they're not a veteran, who needs them. But maybe that's focusing on detail. Aaron, did Starmer's speech lift spirits at conference?
Well, maybe in conference hall, but more broadly, not really. It's been a really difficult conference for Labour because obviously the vibe following the last week has been a very difficult one. I watched that speech, and I found it a very meandering, strange, disjointed speech. I've written about that. You can read about my thoughts on the speech on novaramedia.com. But it was in some parts quite impressive. I mean, what you just referred to there was impressive, Southport too. But there was a real dissonance between him talking about a government in service of working people, and that was a real key theme he repeated time after time after time, and then, of course, the revelations of the last week. I think, actually, Giftgate, or whatever you want to call it, is a real problem for Labour, because what it's done and what it means is that it's nullified Labour's central line of attack against the Conservatives. Every time they say service, duty, sleaze, people think, what about you lot? There was one line that really stuck in my mind when he talked about trust being in the water in this country, besides other things like effluent and E. coli, thanks to probably owned water companies and chicken farmers. But it's a strange thing to say that, to say the default of the British public is high trust, common sense, decency, fairness. But then you think that you have a right to go and see Taylor Swift and get designer ties and have a £14,000 birthday bash paid for by a millionaire while you're cutting winter fuel allowance to struggling pensioners. On the one hand, you're saying that people really believe in fairness, and then you're acting really differently. So in the context of the last week, I thought the speech was particularly strange.
I agree with you. It was fairly meandering. I mean, I'm never sure why they make them an hour long, right? It's so like how many people in the country are going to watch an hour long speech? Make it 20 minutes and then get your key messages out, and people might actually watch the goddamn thing. I thought it was meandering. In general, though, the speech was also light on policy, which we've come to expect from this Labour Party. In terms of a governing philosophy, I thought this was potentially the meatiest section.
If we want justice to be served, some communities must live close to new prisons. If we want to maintain support for the welfare state, then we will legislate to stop benefit fraud, do everything we can to tackle worklessness. If we want cheaper electricity, we need new pylons overground. Otherwise, the burden on taxpayers is too much. If we want home ownership to be a credible aspiration for our children, then every community has a duty to contribute to that purpose. And if we want to tackle illegal migration seriously, we can't pretend that there's a magical process that allows you to return people here unlawfully without accepting that process will also grant some people asylum. And if we're serious about levelling up, then we must be proud to be the party of wealth creation, unashamed to partner with the private sector, and perhaps most importantly, that just because we all want low tax and good public services, that does not mean that the iron law of properly funding policies can be ignored. Because it can't. We've seen the damage that does, and I will not let that happen again. I will not let Tory economic recklessness hold back the working people of this country. And let me tell you something else I won't let happen. I will never let a minority of violent, racist thugs terrorise our communities.
That's that last comment that got him, I think, the sort of longest ovation of the speech. But I suppose, Aaron, why I thought that was a bit interesting, and I suppose at least a bit different from the Conservatives, is he was sort of saying, there are trade-offs. If we want growth, we're going to have to make some compromises here. And it wasn't just, the George Osborne thing of we've got to be tough and we've got to cut public services. He's also saying you might have to accept a prison getting built near you. You might have to accept some pylons in your local field. It seemed like he wasn't just picking on the most vulnerable in society. When you say we're all in it together, some of us are going to have to suffer. The rest of us hopefully will enjoy something. It seemed, at least a bit different to the Conservatives.
Isn't it interesting, Michael, that he is now the arch MB? Some of you will have to live near prisons. Yet as the MP for his patch in central London, he opposed HS2 having anything to do with Euston, because of course it's in his constituency. So on the one hand, he's a YIMBY, you're just going to have to get used to it. But when he was a new MP, he didn't want HS2 because of the disruption it would cause to Euston, of course, his constituency is Holborn and St Pancras. So again, I take it with a pinch of salt. What I would say is, though, of course, he's right to say those things he said, but those were the highlights. You know, we're not showing you like some stuff that's okay. That's common sense. Yeah, I can get on board with that. It's broadly post-political. It's post-ideological. Yeah, you know, we should have some idea of the public good, and sometimes that will supervene over one's private interests. Sorry, the public good is more important. That's a basic principle of social democracy and also, of course, of socialism. Yes, but what you just showed there, that was the kind of highlight. That's when you go, okay, fair enough. You know, that was his rallying cry. You too can have a prison built near you. Now, I appreciate that being a good orator doesn't necessarily mean you're a capable politician. Quite the opposite, in fact. But he is now the prime minister. We do need something of a vision, Michael, and it needs to be about a bit more than pylons above ground. We do need those. That does matter. But I did find it quite illuminating in a way that talking about pylons got a standing ovation from people. I think that says quite a lot about where Labour is when it comes to substantive policy right now.
Like making digs at the Greens, and sort of one of the talking points has been the Green MP who blocked that. So I think that's probably why it got the standing ovation. Let's look at a word cloud, because I think when it comes to these speeches, people don't really watch them anyway. I don't think they're going to change much. People do pay more attention to scandals. They pay more attention to decisions. And when it comes to that, Starmer doesn't seem to have done very well. This is a word cloud from Savanta. They asked 2,000 people to give them one word to describe Keir Starmer. The most popular word, you can see here in the middle, was liar. To be fair to him, the second one was good. You got liar, then good, then boring, idiot, strong. Oh, actually, useless, I think, probably comes in third there, doesn't it? So liar, good, useless, and then I'd say idiot, strong, and boring, and weak are all sort of drawn for fourth. Aaron, can a politician turn this around? I mean, it's silly to ask. Obviously, he can turn this around. He's going to be in government, presumably, for another 4 years at least. But it is. I mean, it's very. Is it surprising? I suppose we knew quite a lot about him before he was elected, but it's unusual, let's say, so soon after someone being elected, for people to dislike them this much. I suppose with the exception of Liz Truss.
Yeah, it's hugely surprising. I think one of the reasons why there is this anger now against Keir Starmer, and by the way, some of the polling by More in Common over the last week, and I was lucky enough to be on their panel yesterday. Luke from More in Common was talking about it. He said, look, people are really angry about this stuff. It's on a par with the expenses scandal. I mean, I find that strange, but that's just where we are. And I think the reason why people are so angry with that, Michael, with Labour, even though the qualitative nature of this is nothing like what we had with the Tories, and particularly after 2019 through to 2024, even though it's nowhere near as bad, I think people, even Tory voters, even, Lib Dem sort of Tory waverers, were kind of convinced that this stuff would broadly stop. And I think within months for it to be back again, I think has stupefied people. And I think that is the word to use here. I think they are stupefied. They're perplexed. What, really? I didn't have high hopes for the guy, but this is outlandish. And he doesn't seem to realize it's a problem, despite banging on about it for several years. So, it's a major, major problem. And there are many people here, Michael, I've spoken to delegates, advisors, people that work for MPs, people across the party, ideologically, left, right, centre. Many, many people have said they don't think Keir Starmer will be the party's candidate at the next general election, which, again, takes me back. I have no vested interest in that fundamentally. I don't want to be making comments on YouTube and be proven wrong and look stupid, right? Which, of course, that happens to all of us in journalism. But that's what people have said to me, and I find that really surprising. I mean, you have to bear in mind, Labour in July won more seats than Margaret Thatcher ever won in 79, in 83, and 87. Ever. The most successful, I think, post-war prime minister in this country, is certainly the most consequential. Starmer won more parliamentarians than her. And yet we've gone to the situation where Labour is polling 29% in the polls. I think there was one, had them on 32, 33 today, I think maybe. Another one on 30 more recently. 6 in 10 people don't trust Keir Starmer, which is congruent. It aligns with that word cloud. And he's losing a lot of trust. We had some council by-elections last week in places like Worthing, in London. You saw falls of like 90, 30%. Those are just council by-elections. They don't mean a thing. But when you see the polling, you see the word clouds, anecdotally, from what I hear, there are people saying here at conference, it all adds up to quite a grim picture for Labour. And there does seem to be a major problem here. I said this on the panel I spoke to yesterday. The short campaign between April and July probably wasn't a very good campaign for Labour. Of course, they start that polling 45, they end it polling 33.5. So that's a disappointment. But the 18 months leading up to that, they were a very effective political organisation. They got basically everything right in terms of communications, in terms of setting themselves up to win that general election. They got everything right. And then since July, they've basically got everything wrong. And it is like looking at two different political parties, a different set of operators, different comms teams. Why has that happened? I mean, one theory is, of course, that Sue Gray now has more of his bandwidth as Prime Minister and Morgan McSweeney has less. And so we're seeing a real shift in how Labour does politics. McSweeney's mission is that Labour continue to campaign in government. They become an insurgent government, in the words of Peter Mandelson about New Labour, but they don't look like that. I think Blair had a great line about New Labour being the political wing of the British people. I think within 3 months, within 100 days, Keir Starmer's Labour Party looked like a liquid distillation of the permanent political class. And first impressions are really, really hard to shake.
That many people thinking you're a liar. EJ asks on Super Chat, how much longer until he's kicked out of office? I suppose Aaron's just sort of covered that question. Not with a concrete prediction, but I suppose it's much sooner than we would have expected for people to even be posing the question. The speech, sort of as we've suggested, was fairly uneventful, meandering. It did contain, though, one painful gaffe.
I call again for restraint and de-escalation at the border between Lebanon and Israel. Again, all parties to pull back from the brink. I call again for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of the sausages, the hostages.
The return of the sausages. Can you imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had gone and given a speech which contained those lines, and then he'd said the return of the sausages, referred to the Israelis who are being held hostage in Gaza as sausages. The return of the hostages. The save didn't quite work. Lots of people talking about that online, by the way. That might be the line that most people remember from this speech. Of course, as well, like Rachel Reeves yesterday, Starmer was heckled.
Every child, every person deserves to be respected for the contribution they make. My sister was I think this guy's obviously got a pass from the 2019 conference. We changed the party.
So that heckler was shouting, even the children of Gaza. So Keir Starmer talking about how all children deserve, I suppose, was it respect or dignity? I'm not sure. He's saying, even the children in Gaza, Keir sort of cracks a joke, I suppose. Aaron, what did you think of those two moments?
Well, your point about Corbyn is really important, Michael. I personally find this stuff incredibly fatuous. It's amusing. It's amusing to confuse. It's a pretty big mishap, isn't it? To confuse the words hostages with sausages. These people are in a life imperiling situation, and you're talking about a pork product, and much favoured by Brits in their full English. Very unfortunate.
Well, actually, that just reminds me. If this was Corbyn, they would have said, and not only did he mistake what they are, but he mistook them for a pork product. That would have been the anti-Semitism angle. You don't get that with Keir Starmer.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We had years, Michael. We had 4 years of the entirety of this would have been on Newsnight. These people claimed to be serious. This would have been on Newsnight, would have been Question Time, would have been LBC. James O'Brien would have been taken out from Labour Party conference in an ambulance because he was having an aneurysm. He's not sausages, right? Keir Starmer says it. Of course, some people remarking online, I'm sure we talked about it a little bit, that would have been the key takeaway from Jeremy Corbyn's speech as leader of the opposition or prime minister or whatever. It really does help shine a light on like I said, the fatuousness, the triviality of British media between 2015 and 2019. And that matters because right now in 2024, everybody is saying the country's screwed, nothing works, The 2024 general election was the nothing works election. That's why the Tories got 24%. And by the way, that's why Labour had this huge historic majority, because nothing works. The Tories have completely screwed the country in so many ways. The media didn't really talk about that between 2015 and 2019 because they were literally talking about things like Corbyn making gaffes, like confusing the word hostages for sausages, and the country's paid a price as a result.
Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon have killed more than 550 people, with at least 50 children among the dead. This means this has been, or Monday was, the deadliest day for Lebanon since the end of its civil war in 1990. Here's how the BBC reported on Israel's attacks.
Israel said it hit around 1,300 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon yesterday. There were warnings, phone messages to residents to leave areas where Hezbollah weapons were stored, and this from Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Don't let Hezbollah endanger your lives and the lives of your loved ones. Don't let Hezbollah endanger Lebanon. Please, get out of harm's way now.
On the roads, a mass exodus, tens of thousands heading north towards Beirut. And in the port city of Sidon, people took whatever transport they could to get to safety. This school opened its gates to give shelter to families. This woman said, "They struck right next to our house and our building was shaking. We got very stressed. This is why we had to leave and we came here. We were told it's safe here." Hezbollah, which is designated a terrorist organisation by the UK government, has hit back. In northern Israel, David had seconds to get into a safe room before a rocket came through his roof. He says Israel did not want this war.
We don't have a war with them. They start with no reason. So now we are giving back.
So the idea that Hezbollah attacks are happening for no reason is pretty rich. Hezbollah is committed to supporting the Palestinian cause, and the rockets sent by the group into Israel are in response to Israel's genocidal war against Gaza. If there were no genocidal war against Gaza, there wouldn't be rockets being fired into Israel. So if they want them to stop, they could agree to a ceasefire. The BBC in Gaza, a ceasefire in Gaza, what the Israelis want to do is have a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah while they can sort of portion off Gaza and say, we'll continue that one there. And the BBC were probably also a little too credulous in their reporting of Israel warning Lebanese citizens to move away from Hezbollah stockpiles. As we heard on yesterday's show, where any Hezbollah unit stores its weapons is not shared with any other Hezbollah members, let alone random members of the public. So what is Israel trying to achieve by causing this level of deaths and chaos in Lebanon? Well, Israeli spokesperson David Mencer said this to international media today.
The Prime Minister has made abundantly clear precisely why we are fighting this war. He said that it's an action against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Our position is that Israel is not waiting any longer after 11 and a half months for this threat. We are preempting it everywhere, in every sector, constantly. Israel is eliminating these senior Hezbollah terrorist figures and their missiles as well. And it's an action to defend this country in our north, and it is ongoing. The Prime Minister has also made clear, and for this, he has the backing of the entire 9 or 10 million people living here, that whoever tries to harm this country, we will harm them all the more forcefully.
So David Mencer there was refusing to acknowledge the real reason that Hezbollah have been firing rockets into Israel for the last 11 months. As I say, they're opposed to Israel's genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza. One thing he said, though, which did contain a shred of truth, was about Israeli support for these kinds of operations. So the Financial Times reports that Netanyahu's popularity has rebounded after aggressive operations against Hamas and Hezbollah. It was only after the assassination of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh that Netanyahu's Likud party took the lead in opinion polls, and that was for the first time since October the 7th. And as of this afternoon, Netanyahu will have another assassination to celebrate. Israel claims to have killed senior Hezbollah commander Ibrahim Mohammed al-Qubasi today in an airstrike on the southern suburbs of Beirut. So how might Hezbollah respond to the ramping up of Israeli attacks? Well, in part, that will depend on what support they can get from elsewhere, principally their key sponsors in Iran. And the Iranian president, has said this to CNN.
Hezbollah by herself cannot stand against a country that is armed to the teeth and has access to weapon systems that are far superior to anything else. Now, if there is a need, Islamic countries must convene a meeting in order to formulate a reaction to what is occurring. Now, if we're speaking of Hezbollah alone, what can Hezbollah do alone? The regional countries, Islamic countries must sit together. We must not allow for Lebanon to become another Gaza at the hands of Israel. Hezbollah cannot do that alone. Hezbollah cannot stand alone against a country that is being defended and supported and supplied by Western countries, European countries, and the United States of America.
News of how the British government are responding also arrived this afternoon. The Times reports that the MOD are making preparations for the evacuation of around 10,000 British nationals who remain in Lebanon. Commercial flights are still operating from Lebanon, but there are fears that Israel will bomb the Beirut International Airport as they did in 2006. Extra UK troops are expected to be deployed to Cyprus to help with rescue efforts. It does seem like lots of people do think we are heading for a much wider form of war. I mean, it's strange to say it, isn't it? Because my partner said yesterday, I mean, are they at war? Because I mean, in many ways, there's active fighting. I suppose it's the Lebanese government that hasn't officially got involved yet. But as far as I understand, if Israel were to sort of extend their actions into Lebanon, that would involve them firing on loads of state infrastructure, including airports, because they say it's dual capacity. What do you see happening?
Well, I mean, that's obviously the key question. But I would partly answer that by posing a question to you, Michael, and of course all the people listening and watching, which is, does Lebanon have a right to defend itself? You know, we have heard that from commentators and politicians repeatedly in regards to Israel after October 7th. Israel has a right to defend itself, of course, against who? Palestine is not a sovereign state, it's an occupied territory. Often we invoke that term, right to self-defense, against other sovereign states, by sovereign states and for sovereign states. So the question being, if there is, like you say, significant attacks, and that's already begun, so it's not an if there are significant attacks on Lebanese national infrastructure, does Lebanon have a right to defend itself? I think it obviously does. That's enshrined in international law. You're the person who delves into the detail on this stuff, so I'd like to know what you think. Iran's certainly not going to step back. You know, Iran has been politically invested in Hezbollah since the inception of Hezbollah, since the early 1980s. Iran has been invested in Hezbollah as a bulwark against Israel for a very long time, and that's not going to change. If there is an anchor in Iranian foreign policy, it is support for Hezbollah. If that changes, anything is up for grabs. So I certainly can't see that happening. And the question really is, again, for the West. That, Israel now, and particularly the administration of Benjamin Netanyahu, clearly sees its rational self-interest consisting in a permanent war in West Asia. That's clearly the Israeli position now. We've talked about this on the show repeatedly. That's partly because it means that the United States remains enmeshed in the region rather than move further east and quote-unquote deal with China in the Pacific. We've talked about it in the context of purely Benjamin Netanyahu's political interests, although, of course, this war has a lot of consent from across the Israeli political class. Is the West, are Europeans happy with permanent war in West Asia? The war on terror, and I say this a lot, and I think there's a lot of cope from right-wingers in refusing to accept my point. The war on terror displaced 38 million people. And many of those people have subsequently come to Europe in terms of the quote-unquote refugee crisis. 38 million people. Do you want Israel going toe-to-toe with Iran and Lebanon and, of course, Gaza, as it already has done, and Yemen? We could see a regional war where another 38 million people are displaced. So if you're cheering on Israel today, please don't come whinging to the rest of us about how Iranian refugees shouldn't be in Britain in the 2030s. We are a country with significant influence and power, particularly in the institutions at the global level, from, the G7s, the IMF, the World Bank, but particularly with regards to the UN, because, of course, we're on the UN Security Council. The British government, which, let's remember, is a Labour government led by Keir Starmer, should be taking a much firmer, harsher line on Israel. In terms of military hardware, two countries matter, the US and Germany. They export, I think, basically 99% at this point of Israel's arms imports. And of course, there's China. Those are the three big players here, two great powers and one major exporter of hardware. But Britain is a major player. And countries like Britain, France, Italy, if they were much, much harsher on Israel, I think it would actually make a huge difference.
Labour's conference is still being dogged by the row over MP's penchant for accepting luxury gifts and hospitalities from wealthy donors. And the ongoing scrutiny seems to be fraying the temper of Health Secretary Wes Streeting.
I'm really proud of people who want to contribute not just their time and volunteering, but their money to our politics. It is a noble pursuit, just like giving to charity, and we don't recognise that enough. The alternative is we ask taxpayers to fund our politics. I think they'd rather their taxes went into the NHS and our schools or stayed in their own pockets.
That's so stupid. I mean, for a start, the amount of money that we're talking about here is quite small, right? So if you were to have taxpayers replace all of the money that comes from these big private individuals going to political parties, it would be absolutely minuscule. So the idea that these big wealthy donors are coming forward to save the rest of us money, right? It's talking to us, it's treating us like absolute children, right? This is like giving to charity. Does he also say that about the donors to the Tory party? Right? Does he say that to people who are donating to Reform, that these are just charitable individuals? Did he say that about Aaron Banks when he was donating to the Leave campaign? Right? This idea that we're reframing people who use their money to donate to political parties, presumably to get some influence back. The idea that that is just charity is just, I don't think anyone watching that is going to be convinced by Wes Streeting there. For those listening on the podcast, Streeting looked rather harried, his eyes bulging with frustration. But the Health Secretary isn't the only one wishing this would all go away. Starmer biographer Tom Baldwin seemed keen to characterise it as a media storm in a teacup.
It could have been better handled. There could have been a clothing allowance for the Prime Minister and his wife paid for out of party funds rather than a gift in kind from a particular person. But again, this is optics. And people enjoying this.
It is optics.
Equivalence. And I think there's a lot of genuine irritation here in Liverpool that people are sort of drawing equivalence between taking £5,000 for dresses so that you can look professional and good in election and not be criticised for what you're wearing, because she certainly would have been if she wasn't. And hundreds of millions of pounds handed out to your mates in PPE contracts. Yeah. What's that?
I said her husband's a millionaire and she works for a living. She can buy her own frocks.
He's a millionaire because he owns a house in London. I don't think actually they're rolling in money. I think they will be buying their own frocks or their own suits and their own glasses in the future. But this, this is like, people don't.
Why is that, do you think? Because the optics.
There's
genuine frustration. Maybe not in Liverpool, but certainly around the nation. There is genuine frustration that the Prime Minister and his wife and the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister were taking freebies.
They weren't taking freebies off the taxpayer. They weren't using hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to hand out PPE contracts to their mates. Look, I'll just say this with greatest respect. I used to be a journalist.
Not, but go on.
And I broke a story about the last Labour government, about Bernie Ecclestone. That was, I think, genuine corruption. That was about a secret £1 million donation which changed government policy on tobacco advertising. Yep. This is about some frocks. And I think that journalists and the media need to show a sense of perspective, because if you draw equivalence between genuine scandals and this froth, I think, then you're not going to have the right words to describe the genuine scandals in the future.
One thing he did have a point about there, which was the Bernie Ecclestone stuff when he donated money to New Labour. That was secret, right? So what we keep hearing from the Labour Party, from Labour politicians, is we've followed the rules. And from what we know so far, they have followed the rules, right? But people don't like this. And people don't believe Tom Baldwin saying, if she hadn't worn a dress bought by this billionaire, people would also have complained, right? If she'd just worn a dress from H&M or Zara, right? No one was going to say, what the hell was the Prime Minister's wife wearing? That just, I've never really seen that happen in British news. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've just missed the articles. Baldwin there, Starmer's biographer, seems very cozy with him. He may be trying to minimise the row, but the public are pretty clear on it. 64% of people think it's unacceptable for MPs to take tickets to football matches or concerts from donors and companies, and 44% say it's completely unacceptable Only 25% think it's okay. I mean, it's not just galling that politicians like Keir Starmer on six-figure salaries aren't dipping into their own pockets to pay for their lavish lifestyles. It's also an issue of influence. Who among us believes that these generous individuals and businesses are buying MPs gifts out of the goodness of their hearts? In the summer of last year, the now Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds and two senior Labour figures went to Glastonbury Festival as guests of YouTube. They weren't camping in a mud-spattered tent. Eva Reynolds declared that his swanky Glasto package was worth over $3,000, as Adam Ramsey writes for Novara Media. Until then, Labour was promising to increase the digital service tax from 2% to 10%, which would bring in billions from giants like Google and Facebook. Literally the day after the festival, it emerged that Reynolds had ditched the policy. Voters would have to accept austerity instead. So this is the day after. Now, Adam Ramsey, actually, I do recommend reading the whole article. He's saying, no, it's not necessarily the case that decision was made because Jonathan Reynolds had just had a fab time in a teepee at Glastonbury. But, YouTube clearly thought it was more beneficial to have that conversation dancing by the pyramid stage than it was to have it in business attire, in an ordinary meeting, which is minuted. Now, again, this is not to suggest that Jonathan Reynolds made this decision at the pyramid stage, but you can see why questions are raised in situations such as this. There's another story, though, around Labour donations that's getting less attention than it probably should. And it turns out it's about the largest ever donation to the party. So just before the general election, £4 million was given to Starmer's party from a Cayman Islands hedge fund with shares in arms and fossil fuels. The hedge fund is called Quadrature Capital. They told Open Democracy this about that £4 million donation. In May 2024, we came to the view that a UK government with a commitment to the green transition of the economy would have the ability to drive change that is so urgently needed. Having analysed commitments set out by each party, we donated £4 million to the Labour Party in support of policies that will deliver climate action while also promoting social equity and economic resilience. Oh, they sound wonderful, don't they? Quadrature Capital. And of course, one might question whether a commitment to climate action is consistent with investments in fossil fuel companies. But on that front, the company also had a defense. This is from that Open Democracy article. After publication of this article, Quadrature said it uses market-neutral trading strategies, meaning it holds long and short positions, stocks at the same time, and does not hold any position for extended periods of time. Hedge funds typically use such trading strategies to try to profit from both the rise and fall of stock prices. The company added that SEC filings do not fully represent its position towards various industries, including the oil and gas industry, as SEC regulations require the fund to disclose only its long positions, i.e., a bet that the price of a given stock would rise at a particular point in time, but not its short positions, i.e. that the price of a stock would fall. That was very complicated, but that was a reminder. I had to be sort of reminded what hedge funds do. They basically make lots and lots of little bets, and they bet. They try and sort of balance out their bets. So they're betting this stock might go up, this stock might go down, and they don't tend to have long-term positions. So their argument there is they don't necessarily have an interest in, say, oil prices going up or the share prices of oil companies going up because they might have as many bets that they're about to go down. I still don't think that makes this really any less shady. And another element of this story that's interesting is the timing of this information being released. This mega donation was made to the Labour Party just after the July general election was called. So after it was called, but before it happened. The details about it were only published last week, though. And earlier today, I spoke to Ethan Schoen. He's the author of that piece. And I asked him if that delay between receiving the donation and publishing it was normal.
No, in a word. I mean, we risk getting into the kind of, especially exciting realms of like electoral commission rules and regulations here. But the kind of quick version of this is that, generally speaking, large donations to political parties, that is over about £11,000, they are the parties keep a record of those, and for every quarter, they will file a return to the Electoral Commission, which is then published by the Commission on their website the following quarter. That's how it works generally, which I think makes sense. Outside of an election period, there's not really a great argument for a faster kind of process of transparency than that. But what happens during an election is, in recognition of the fact that people might like to know who is funding the parties that they decide to vote for or not. During the election, what happens is we enter a period during which the Electoral Commission requests that same information on a weekly basis and publishes it on its website within a week. So the election was called, and due to a kind of quirk, or you might call it a loophole in the regulations that determine this kind of thing, there is a week between the election being called and what's called the kind of official pre-poll reporting period coming into effect. Now that's when the donations are made public before the election, where possible. Some stuff comes in on polling day, and that comes out quite soon afterwards. This donation happened to come in during that week between the election being called and the pre-poll reporting period. Now, we can probably talk a bit about what we can infer from that, I suppose. But I think it's worth noting that the amount of kind of discussion and the pure practicalities involved of a political party accepting a donation of this amount of money means that it is completely unfathomable that the first that Labour were made aware that this donation was coming was a matter of days before it came in, and therefore there wasn't some intention behind it being accepted during this period in which it would only be made public after people had voted in the election.
So you think sort of that they went for this loophole because they potentially said to them before that when the election is called, give us this donation, but early enough that we don't have to declare it? I mean, is that the assumption?
I would say so, and I mean, I think there's a number of reasons to suspect that that's the case. I mean, firstly, there was a kind of pre-existing connection between Quadrature and the Labour Party. As an organisation, Quadrature had never donated to Labour before; it's never donated to any political party. But a very senior member of staff at the firm had given, I think, when this donation came, he had given around £250,000, probably slightly more, to the party in the preceding year or so. He was a kind of early donor to Labour Together, and had since given to the party to the tune of about £250,000. There's also kind of, I suppose, what you might describe as like a bit of a history here, particularly during the Starmer project. Starmer himself, during his leadership election, I'm sure many people will kind of remember this, acted within the rules for MPs declaring donations, but he intentionally waited until after Labour members had voted in the leadership election to declare a number of his kind of big money backers. And I think had the names of those backers been made public, it would have undermined the image that Starmer kind of tried to portray in that election, which is one of kind of continuity Corbynism, but like in a suit. There were people that had long been associated with the Labour right, and I think there's good reason to believe that was done intentionally. You also have Labour Together, this kind of Starmerite think tank / kind of super PAC, which in its very earliest days took an awful lot of money from some of the same figures that gave to Starmer's leadership campaign. But for a long time, over a couple of years, no donations were declared to the Electoral Commission as they should have been, and Labour Together ended up being fined by the Electoral Commission for a number of breaches of electoral law. The common thread throughout all this, as well as Keir Starmer, is Morgan McSweeney, who we know has a very key role in Starmer's Downing Street operation. He had a key role while they were in opposition, and he was a central figure, and he was, I believe, the director of Labour Together at the time that there was a failure to make these donations public and declare them to Electoral Commission. So, I think viewed in that context, and when we consider the practicalities involved of accepting a donation like this, and we know it's not unusual for big donors to say, look, we will back you in the election with this much, so parties can plan ahead. That's to be expected, I think, and quite normal. But the decision to have it accepted during this brief window of kind of intransparency, I think it's very hard to believe that was a coincidence.
You're saying both when Keir Starmer was sort of a leadership candidate and then as leader of the party, you're seeing a similar thing where the rules are formally followed, but they seem to have a preference for big donations to be revealed after key elections as opposed to before them. What would Quadrature Capital be getting out of this? I mean, that's the obvious question here, isn't it? And I suppose, on the one hand, you're talking about this hedge fund in the Cayman Islands. This sounds very dodgy to most people. At the same time, you're saying they've got a climate fund, they donate to climate charities. I assume, sort of, you were speaking to someone from the Labour Party, you'd say these are these are people who have an interest in having a livable planet. Maybe, I'm not sure. And a cynic would say these are the kind of people who want tax cuts, who want tax havens to be protected. How should our audience understand what this kind of company might be wanting from a Labour government?
There's a couple of things to consider here. There's Quadrature, the hedge fund itself, which I think it's perfectly possible to believe that they, as an organisation, have chosen to use some of their profits to fund specific technologies and research in specific areas or specific projects that we would generally recognise as being kind of a good thing. To kind of put it in that technical term, but I think it's equally worth considering that these investments that they make in these projects that they support, they may well find themselves in a position where these technologies require further down the line large amounts of kind of state subsidy to get off the ground. They might find that further down the line they have to kind of, I suppose, fit into an arrangement with the public sector, for instance, or that they end up working hand in hand with the government on these kind of public-private partnership financing deals that are so common now and talked up massively under this Labour Party. So there's a practical element to even the kind of climate donations and the climate funding that they do. But I think it's also worth seeing this donation as part of a broader picture and a broader shift in the kind of interest groups that Labour represents and that give them so much money. I mean, if you think of Quadrature as a hedge fund and as a financial organisation that fits broadly into that sector, £4 million is an awful lot of money, but it's part of a huge amount of money that's come in the last couple of years to the party from individuals and companies that are either kind of actors within the sector currently or have very strong ties to it. So it might be an individual that used to run a couple of hedge funds or a trader or bankers, or it's organisations like Quadrature. We're talking about probably 13 plus million since 2022. And to put that in context, the three biggest trade union affiliates to Labour in the same period gave less than that. They gave around £12 million. So I think if we're thinking about, broadly speaking, who and what the Labour Party represents and in whose interests it acts, we have to kind of consider who, who's funding it, really. And I think there's an interesting parallel to draw there, I suppose, between how hedge funds operate and what their money actually is doing. When they put money into a given security, it's essentially kind of a bet on the movement of that. And so by putting £4 million into the Labour Party, there's kind of you can almost see it as just one of their investments that they are hoping will pay off, and they see benefit to themselves from that investment generating a return. But I think it's important to see it in the context of a big shift toward finance and the City of London in particular throwing its weight behind Labour and what we can kind of draw from that.
As Labour politicians say, it's perfectly normal to accept luxury freebies from business groups and wealthy individuals. One country has demonstrated their different attitude to corporate bungs.
In Singapore's biggest political corruption trial in almost 50 years, a former minister has been convicted after pleading guilty to bribery charges. Subramanian Iswaran had faced 35 charges and now a possible jail sentence. Let's go to the Supreme Court in Singapore and speak to our reporter, Suranjana Tiwari. Just tell us a little bit of the background to this, Suranjana. It's a fascinating case.
Yeah, Subramaniam Iswaran just left the Supreme Court behind me. His trial was actually taking place in the High Court, which is in the same building. He walked into the court to face trial with 35 charges against his name, which included taking gifts as he was a public servant, also for corruption and obstructing justice. But after entering the trial, the prosecutors actually reduced those charges. He now only faces 5 charges, and they dropped the corruption charge. So it's just taking gifts as a public servant and obstruction to justice.
That was a report earlier today on Singapore's biggest corruption scandal in 50 years. Prosecutors are seeking a jail term of 6 to 7 months for the former transport minister, and the crime, for which he has pled guilty, as you heard there, concerns accepting $300,000 worth of gifts. They included flights, hotel stays, and tickets to musicals and the Formula One Grand Prix. Now, does that sound familiar? That's very similar to what our Prime Minister has done and all his cabinet colleagues. And they're telling us this is normal. Starmer and co. keep assuring us that accepting luxury gifts is totally normal. What's going on? Why is Singapore so much tougher on politicians than we are? Well, there is one other difference that Singapore has to the UK. I mean, I'm sure there are many, but one relevant difference here. They have the highest paid officials in the world, with starting salaries of around $750,000 per minister. I think it's about double that for the Prime Minister. In the UK, they get 160 grand or thereabouts. I think if we were to sort of say, let's times the salary of our politicians by 10, it wouldn't be particularly popular. But this was something that was really championed by Lee Kuan Yew. He was the founding Prime Minister of Singapore. He was the leader of the country from the nation's independence in 1959 until 1990. And he oversaw the country's transition from an island nation with a high illiteracy rate and no natural resources into one of the most developed countries in the world. He's often considered to be a somewhat legendary political leader for those reasons. This is how he explained the decision to pay politicians so handsomely.
In most countries, men who go into politics are officially very poorly paid. They get their rewards in other ways, like commissions, kickbacks, patronage, and perks. In America, it is through contacts and consultancies when they leave office. We should not follow these practices. We cannot run a clean and above-board system and ask men and women to lower their earnings for many years. We have worked out a realistic system, paying as near market rates as is practical. But all still lose on what they could have earned outside, and their loss of privacy is not replaceable. I would urge Singaporeans to continue to support this policy of encouraging our best to go into politics as MPs, from whom we can then choose ministers. Do not try to get a government on the cheap. Then we end up with money politics, which will result in a poor bunch of MPs, plus a lot of hypocrisy, fiddling, and eventually dishonesty and corruption.
That was Lee Kuan Yew. Aaron, do you think Singapore have got this right? Pay politicians really well and then throw them to jail for even sort of the slightest whiff of corruption?
Well, look, in the United States, politicians are paid much better than in this country. And I don't think it's particularly lacking in corruption there. I don't think MPs are paid too little. I think it's very odd that the Prime Minister gets paid so little in comparison to other public offices. I think it's odd, for instance, that Sue Gray is earning more than the Prime Minister. I find it odd that many councils will have a council chief executive. They may even have other roles, non-chief executive roles, who earn more than the Prime Minister of the whole country. I think that's crazy. I think the Prime Minister probably should earn a little bit more. I think MPs earn good money, Michael. I think this year they're on, what, £90,000 backbenchers, plus a very lucrative pension, plus expenses, plus your housing is paid for half the week. So I don't think that that's a problem. Yes, of course, you're missing out on some people who would earn significantly more, but I think the median person entering politics for the Tories or the Labour Party, they're definitely not down, especially that pension. So you might say, look, we should bump it up 10 or 15%. But I think the figures that are being quoted relative to Singapore are outlandish. It is interesting, isn't it, that you've got somebody like Keir Starmer saying that I want to bring politics back to the people. I want to make public service the cornerstone of how we do politics at Westminster. Well, if you're going to do that, yes, you're going to have a really strong rethink about donations and gifts. Going back to what Wes Streeting said, rather wide-eyed in that clip a few moments ago, in one of the previous stories, it is not the same thing to donate money to a political party, to print off leaflets, to hire organisers, to get ads. You might have some negative views on that stuff, but that is qualitatively different to buying gifts for somebody who isn't just an MP, but is a member of the cabinet. They're a member of the government making really important decisions. My view is if you're in the cabinet, you absolutely should not be receiving any kind of gift whatsoever. If you're a civil servant, you can't. If you're a local councillor, it's really hard to accept any kind of gift whatsoever. My wife's a councillor. She has to declare anything over £50. Of course, this was all being declared, but the culture around local government, to me, from what I've seen, seems far more stringent than it does for the people literally making the policies which take this country forward. So I would prohibit gifts, certainly for members of cabinet and the Prime Minister. I probably would pay the Prime Minister more, but I would probably also get rid of a lot of MPs. I think, for instance, we should be paying councillors twice as much as they presently get. They presently don't really get paid. They get expenses of around £12,000 to £15,000 a year. I would probably double that and halve the number of councillors. I'd probably give backbenchers, fine, a bit of a pay rise, certainly the Prime Minister, probably the Cabinet too. I'd probably move from 650 to 600 MPs. I do think the Singapore approach is easier for a country of that size. You know, Singapore doesn't have a population of 68 million. It doesn't have a litany of councillors and mayors and MPs. So there are many, many cuts to make in the number of bureaucrats and politicians we have. Let's do it. And okay, fine, let's bump up the pay a little bit more too. But I do think there's a deeper problem here that basically, partly as an outgrowth, I think, of neoliberalism over the last 45 years, we don't really believe in public duty and public service. We do, but it doesn't really transfer to politics, you know. And I think that's really exemplified in how you had people like Bridget Phillipson like smiling at the idea that a donor would give them £14,000 to throw a birthday party. Like they think it's a normal, healthy entitlement. Whereas obviously somebody like Lee Kuan Yew was very overt. You know, if you have that approach, you're going to get very poor politicians and very poor outcomes. But on that point of don't try and do politics on the cheap, I think that's probably right.
I'm sure we'll be talking about Giftgate more. I'd love to talk about Singapore more, but for now, we run out of time. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me tonight from Labour Party Conference.
My pleasure, Michael. I'm going to enjoy Liverpool for one more hour before I get on the train back to the South Coast.
One more. I was wondering if you were going to be doing karaoke tonight, but no, you're going to be back home tonight, fresh, to be back on Novara Media very soon, I'm sure. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.